as a parent, you're
Yeah.
kind of, there's always is a lot of judgment. And I think there's a lot of judgment about sleep. Think of newborns, right? The first thing people say to
Ugh,
a, right when you're popping, how are they sleeping,
how
right?
are they
People think that's like a
sleeping?
curious question, but we feel a lot of pressure.
How are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? I'm Dr. Shelby Harris, licensed clinical psychologist and director of sleep health at Sleepopolis, where we dive deep into all things sleep. If you like Sleep Talking with Dr. Shelby, take a second right now to like this video on YouTube or give us a 5-star rating through Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I know it seems simple, but it helps us reach a lot more people to get them the rest they deserve. And if you're tired of hitting that snooze button, hit the subscribe button instead. A new episode of science-backed sleep tips is available every other Wednesday. Welcome back, listeners, to part 2 of our special 3-part episode on kids and sleep, in recognition of Children's Awareness Month this June to reflect on how we can prioritize our children's health and well-being. In part 1, Drs. Andrea Roth and Allison Shale and I discussed common sleep behaviors and treatments for children, from newborns through grade schoolers, including when to talk to a psychologist. Today, in part 2, we're diving even deeper. Next time, in part 3, Dr. Andrea, Dr. Allison, and I will wrap things up by answering your questions, listeners. Everything you've submitted through YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and of course, our website, sleepopolis.com. Thank you so much to all the listeners who submitted questions for this episode. We're really excited to dive into them. Remember, if you have questions for future episodes, you can always add them to the episode comments below if you're watching this on YouTube. You can also send questions via Facebook or Instagram at Sleepopolis and at SleepDocShelby. Now, let's reintroduce our guests. With over 10 years' experience treating children in schools, hospitals, and private practice, psychologist Dr. Andrea Roth is known for her expertise in sleep and anxiety for children. Versed in a wide range of childhood concerns, Dr. Andrea loves providing insight and support to parents to ensure that when kids master new skills, their caregivers also gain the knowledge and confidence to be as supportive as possible. Bringing another 10 years of experience to us today is Dr. Allison Shale, a psychologist and director of Shale Psychology. Specializing in anxiety, ADHD, depression, sleep disturbances, and behavior problems, Dr. Allison aims for children to feel understood and heard while providing parents with tangible strategies and insight that can benefit the entire family and last a lifetime. And I'm also so honored to be co-authoring an upcoming book for parents on kids' sleep with them as well. So keep an eye out for that. Dr. Andrea, Dr. Allison, we are so glad you're here. Welcome to Sleep Talking with Dr. Shelby. Overstimulation before bed, like the roughhousing, the exciting games. Is it just like a lot of, not to make generalizations, but a lot of dads like to roughhouse before bed. I think about my husband, like to do that with my son. Do you recommend against that? Does it matter? Where are you on that?
So I think it's interesting because I feel like there's this idea that like bedtime has to be perfectly calm, roughhousing has to stop by like X
Yeah.
o'clock and blah, 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 blah. And I have heard other experts talk about like, no, that's fine. I think that if they need that rough and
Mm-hmm.
tumble play, that's fine. You just build it into the evening routine and maybe like put it up front so that they can start settling.
Okay.
I think again, it's this idea of like the happy medium. I think unfortunately when if it's a two-parent household, sometimes second parent doesn't come home until later. And that's kind of like the way that they play with their kid. We have to allow for that a little bit as long as like, again, that parent then has the psychoeducation of you can do that, but then you need to be thoughtful about the clock and starting to downshift at
Mm-hmm.
some point as well. It just can't be like the last thing you do before bed. Allison, what about kids with ADHD? Just because, like you, I
Yeah.
feel like see that so much more than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of
Yeah.
wind down. I mean, I talk to parents all the time about just like wind down. And again, it's just like knowing your kid, right? Some kids can, even with ADHD, can just like get into bed and put their head
Hmm.
down and like be good. Some kids really do need like that kid I was talking about, he needs that like 20, 25 minutes in bed with dad. And that's kind of his calm down sort of time. So it makes things take a little longer, but they're accounting for it. It benefits him. It seems to be
Yeah.
beneficial for the relationship. So again, and not seeing things as so rigid of like, you cannot do that. That really works for them, for this kid who happens to have ADHD. And, so I think it's more about knowing your kid and how much downtime, how much, kind of come down time they need to be able to get into bed and not spend 45 minutes tossing and turning until they actually fall asleep. We'd like them to fall asleep quicker than that so they don't get restless when possible. So again, you can't control everything, but if you can, that helps.
Right. That's such a good point. It is
Oh
so
yeah.
also kid to kid based. You're right.
I think we often make these generalizations with like ADHD that they're always going to have trouble falling
Mm-hmm.
asleep or
Mm-hmm.
staying asleep. Not all the
No.
time, but I think we do, like you were
Mhm.
saying, we have to know our kid, know what's helpful. And if that stuff's not helpful enough, then there are other options that we can go to. So it's not always black
Mhm.
and white, but for parents or any guardians listening, are there any guidelines or kind of red flags that then indicate that, okay, I've done these things. I've worked on the screen time. I've worked on a wind down. I'm keeping consistent. I mean, we didn't really talk about caffeine or sugary foods, but we're obviously not giving them lots of caffeine in the evenings and
Right.
loads of sugary foods. But are there things that once you've tried all those sleep hygiene recommendations that would then make you say, okay, it's time to contact a psychologist versus a sleep
Mhm.
specialist? Like, where would a parent want to go as the next steps there?
I feel like for me, the line is always if there is some sort of co occurring behavioral, emotional, psychiatric
Okay.
something going on. I think that if you're trying all of these, I don't know. For me, pediatric sleep is just so behavioral. Like if you're an infant, it's developmentally appropriate that infants sleep all over the place. When you're an adult, it's so complicated because there's so much medical stuff,
Yeah.
hormonal stuff, because that's your lane. But for me, pediatric sleep is just undeniably behavioral. Rarely is it a kid who just like
Right.
is a bad sleeper. I just don't buy into that. I find that it's just so very behavioral. And I think if there's like anything extra, I think my younger clinicians here, they would say if there are any extra spice to them, like they got to go to someone who maybe is a little more trained in working with children that have co-occurring diagnoses, or someone like a psychologist, like a social worker that knows a little bit more about that kind of emotional behavioral treatment.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think that a lot of people's first line of defense is maybe a sleep consultant, a sleep coach. They maybe know someone who used them as a newborn who helped with sleep training or something like that. And then maybe they test that out. And I think for a lot of people, they do then get some support around scheduling, timing, sleep hygiene, things like that. And
Hmm.
very often there are people who come in and they say, like, I worked with a sleep specialist. She helped me with XYZ, but we're still running into trouble because my kid won't stay in the bed, right? That one often jumps out to me as something that a sleep consultant might not know as much about in just not having the training in behavioral work and reinforcement and punishment and shaping behaviors and things like that. And then, of
Hmm.
course, like Andrea said, right, when people say my kid's really anxious or my kid has this diagnosis, then, I think always a therapist, a psychologist, a social worker is a better bet in terms of getting a more comprehensive look at what's going on and how we need to treat it.
Because it's not just behavioral.
And I
Yeah,
mean,
it's not just behavioral on the
yeah.
kids' aspect
No,
or
oh no.
end. It's behavioral a lot of
Right.
times on the
And that's what
parents'
Andrea said.
end.
Andrea
Mhm.
and I both, our sleep
Yeah.
work is very parent heavy. A lot of times when parents reach out,
Yeah.
they'll say something about their kid. And my response is almost always, well, actually, I'm going to just meet with you. And if we then decide that your child needs to be
Yes.
seen, we can do that. But it is going to be much easier for us to focus on
Mhm.
you and change you and then see how your child responds to that. And that throws people
And
off
that's really
big
surprising to a
time.
lot of
Yeah,
parents.
throws
Yeah.
them off. They're like, but no,
Yeah.
no, no, you need to know her. She's so anxious. And I'm like, I totally get it. Let's just see what you're doing in response to that anxiety that maybe, you know, maybe you think you're helping it, but you're actually not. And that is sometimes a light bulb moment for people that they're doing all these things with such good intentions in
Yeah.
terms of how they respond. And then sometimes they do need an outsider to say, well, when we think about it like this, maybe that's actually part of what's maintaining this problem. And that's an easier conversation to have also when the kid's not there.
We are also trained to ask some questions that would lead us to send them to a
Yeah.
sleep specialist, like in a hospital setting, into a clinic, or back to a family doctor or a pediatrician. Um, So we do have these like red flags that we look for in regards to like apnea or restless leg or any sort of kind of medical diagnosis that we know very well. Like we don't deal with that. If there is an underlying medical reason as to why your child is struggling
Right.
to sleep, you should not be coming to see
Yeah.
us. We do not have those credentials. I absolutely want you to go see the medical professional first. And so I think that that's really important that we recognize those things too. I
Yeah.
think that I just empathize so much with families and that your kid struggles to sleep and it seems like there's like this create your own
Yeah.
adventure of I don't even know where to
I
start.
know.
I mean, there was research, gosh, years and years ago at that pediatric sleep meeting about they did this like very casual survey of like where do families go if their child is struggling to sleep. And it was like the pediatrician and the sleep specialist and the clinics were like way down at the bottom. And it was like friends and
Mm-hmm.
family and social media and the internet.
Wow.
It's just like it's so hard. I think that we take for granted that we are in this field or we are in any sort of field adjacent to child development, that we kind of have these ideas of where to go first when our child is struggling that the general public just doesn't have.
And I think to add one little thing to that is that when you were saying like apnea, restless leg, like the simple
Hmm.
things to think about and look for in your child are, is your child snoring? Any pauses in their breathing? Not
Mm-hmm.
just when they have like a cold, but more
Yeah.
Right.
consistently happening. That's definitely a reason to go see an MD sleep specialist, right? Any
Absolutely.
snoring in a child that's consistent should be evaluated.
Yeah.
And then with the
Hmm.
restless legs, anything like that, a lot of children don't report it. They don't, I mean, they're not going to be like, I have restless leg syndrome, but they're feeling like antsy in their legs. They have to get up, walk around. They feel this kind of restless feeling, and everyone describes it different. I had a kid once that described it as bugs crawling up their legs. So
Yeah.
if that's an
Or
issue, yes,
burning. Yeah.
burning, that can impact their ability to fall asleep a lot of times too. So that's when an MD sleep specialist would definitely come into play. And oftentimes we work together with MDs. Right? It's not
Absolutely.
always just clear
Yeah.
cut. Okay, it's
Right.
just,
Mhm.
ADHD and apnea, we know are often related. And we know that kids who have apnea are very restless. A lot of times they don't look sleepy. So we want to address those issues. And then sometimes we have to address more of the bedtime issues that are going to come up too, even if the apnea has been treated. Okay, so let's talk about rooms, right? So a lot of kids are some don't care about their room so much. Others are very particular about their room environment. What do you recommend to families when it comes to like their bedding and the lighting situation? Do they have to have the lights on or off?
I think that our general rules of thumb that, I think you Google this and you get the answer. It's cool, dark, and quiet
Yeah.
is ideally what we want. There are, again, these ideal temperatures in which we're supposed to sleep at in the high 60s, the mid high 60s. Is that everybody? No. We want it to be quiet. So I think if we think about where you live, I think if you live on a busy street, if you're living in an urban setting, having sound machines or something to muffle the noise is important. If you're room sharing with a sibling or another family member, I think that can be
Mm.
helpful. And then dark, you asked about light. I think, again, there's this thought that like, another thing that I think parents sometimes feel shameful for when they come to me, they're like, oh, kid sleeps with a nightlight. I don't want them to. I know they're not supposed to. I know it's supposed to be so dark. And I always say like that's not true. Yes. Do we want them sleeping with the overheads on? No, because that gets very kind of stimulating if they wake up or while they're trying to fall asleep. I think we try as hard as we can to have nightlights be dimmer. I think we have them ideally not be like right in their
Yeah.
eye line. But these are all things that we're allowed to have. It doesn't have to be pitch black. It doesn't have to be 68 degrees. It doesn't have to be like pin
Yeah.
drop silent. But I think these are the ideals that
Yeah.
we like to have.
I agree with all of that. And I think, when it comes to noise machines, night lights, things like that, it's just being mindful of the level of them, right? You're not going to crank that noise machine to 25 and put it right next to
Hmm.
the kid's bed, right? Maybe it's
Hmm.
on the other side of the room, maybe it's closer to your door,
Yeah.
so that it can muffle out if your child's bedroom is off of a living space and it would be very loud and there's a lot of other people around. Putting it by the door, maybe even just putting it in the hallway, right? So there's certainly ways that we can set up these things and they're not so black and white of like, I heard all noise machines are bad, or my child can never sleep with a nightlight. And again, I think it's really trying to
Yeah.
get people to understand that there's a middle ground for a lot of these things. And again, having a flexible
Yeah.
sleeper, one who, if there's a little bit of light in the room, they can still fall asleep. That's not such a horrible thing either. So that when you travel and go places that your child
Hmm.
doesn't need, you know, can't see your fingers kind of dark.
Yeah. I think we get so rigid in our society with these rules and these people who are online who are saying you have to follow this, do this exact thing, this protocol, whatever it might be to guarantee sleep. A, it doesn't always guarantee sleep. And
No.
B, it creates, like you said, someone who might not be such a flexible sleeper. And C, I think it creates so much shame in people a lot of times.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Oh, I think my first one is that like, oh my God, Allison, I feel like yours might be like this too. My first one, I feel like I had all those things in my mind. So she's the one that we had to travel with like the black garbage bags everywhere we went. And then my second is like, he's like, whatever, like I'll sleep. Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah. But, Shelby, what you said, I think there is a lot of shame. I think, like if you go somewhere, you put your baby down for a nap or some of these things and people go, you have the noise machine on? I heard that's bad for their ears. Or, well, why don't you have blackout shades? And I think some of it's not coming from the worst place, but as a parent, you're kind of, there's always is a lot of judgment. And I think there's a lot of judgment about sleep. Think of newborns, right? The first thing people say to right when you're popping, how are they sleeping, right? People think that's like a curious question, but we feel a lot of pressure as if our child's sleep is a reflection of who we are as a parent. So I think that's where some of that rigidity comes from. Of, if I do all of these things, my child will be a good sleeper. I can tell the world my child is a good sleeper. My neighbor did this with their child and he's a good sleeper, so I must, right? So there are so many parental emotions that go into these choices. And so again, that comes back to the same idea of why it's so important that we work with the parents, because we have to be able to validate their own. I get why you did this, to not be someone who's shaming them for whatever choice they made. And really, I try to also come from the framework of you did this thing. You had really good intentions with why you did it, but it's not getting you the result you want. That's the only reason why we need to change it. We don't need to change it because I don't like it or because I think I can do things better than you, right? It's just purely because you're coming to me saying, I don't like what's going on in terms of sleep in my house. Here's what we've done. Tell me something different that I could try. So we try to start right from the beginning of no shame. You did these were thoughtful decisions that you made. You tried them for a long time, often, and your kid isn't sleeping, you're not sleeping, so let's do something different.
I remember when I went back to work in Montefiore at the sleep clinic after having my first, I felt all this pressure to get him sleeping perfectly.
Oh, yeah.
I went back after like 2.5 months because I knew every patient of mine was going to ask me, how is he sleeping, as like a judgment on how I was as a sleep doctor. It's crazy. And even parents feel it so much. So we like to end each episode with a segment called Something to Sleep On. One last point where you'd like to share with anyone looking to change their sleep habits, like any of your thoughts. So Dr. Andrea, Dr. Allison, when it comes to kids and sleep, do you have one final thought for our listeners? Something to sleep on.
I think it's 1,000% consistency. Pick a plan, stick to it, give it a good amount of time to try it out before you say whether it is or isn't working. And just really know that when you've made a decision, you got to follow it and see it through. And then we can always change things and reassess, but stick through it in the moment and let's see where that takes you.
I agree. I totally agree. I think consistency is everything. I think being patient is everything. And if it's like one thing to families, I think it's you should be suspicious of people that work in broad generalizations and kind of say you have to do this, you have to do that. I think the most important thing you can do is be consistent. There has to be a certain amount of tailoring your plan to your individual child. And I think if anyone is telling you that you have to do XYZ, you should be a little bit suspicious.
So Shelby, since you end every episode with something to sleep on, do you have one little nugget of advice for your listeners, something to sleep on?
The shame stuff is a big issue. I think there's no shame in any of this stuff. And sometimes the shame makes you not want to seek out help more and just keep trying random things that you find on, I don't know, Instagram or wherever else. If nothing is working, no shame. See someone who is qualified, who knows what they're doing. Ask, if you're going to see a psychologist, for example, ask them how much sleep training have they had, right? How many patients have they seen? Have they done stuff? I think that's really important, is to just really have no shame and ask questions and see someone who will be able to help you properly. Dr. Andrea, Dr. Allison, thank you both for joining us for part 2 of this 3-part episode. I had so much fun diving into this with you. I hope the listeners could tell it was really a lot of fun. And I can't wait to answer listener questions with you next time in part 3. Thanks for listening to Sleep Talkin' with Dr. Shelby, a Sleepopolis original podcast. Remember, if you're tired of hitting the snooze button, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now in YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And for even more sleep tips, visit sleepopolis.com and my Instagram page at SleepDocShelby. Today's episode was produced and edited by Freddie Beckley. Our Senior Director of Content is Alana Nunez. Our Head of Content is Molly Stout. And I'm Dr. Shelby Harris. Until next time, sleep well.